Thanks everyone for waking up early this morning to come and listen to our presentation. Hopefully it'll be of some interest to you. As Charles said, we here from the Mowat Centre have been working on a project. We're still working on a project that is trying to look at the potential impact of a GAI, or a guaranteed annual income, on social innovation and social entrepreneurs. This is something that is still very much in the early stages of analysis. We're presenting today some preliminary findings from our project, but we're also extremely hungry for insights and ideas about how we might proceed most fruitfully. So please, if you've got some ideas, please let us know, or let us know if there's something we got wrong, something that we've de-emphasized, what we should be emphasizing. So we're really interested to hear what you have to think. So, the agenda for today. I'm going to talk through the first two items we have here on the slide, framing the agenda and the research approach. And then Christine, who's really been deep into this data, is going to talk a little bit about our sort of snapshot of the social entrepreneurs we've been looking at and how we think that a GAI might impact them. I'll come back and finish off with some concluding thoughts. So we're going to start by framing our research here. There's been a real, I don't think I need to tell anyone in this room, but there's been a real resurgence of interest in a GAI globally, even just in the past year. I don't know if this has to do with the fact that Finland is going to be starting a pilot next year, or what exactly is going on, but everyone seems to be talking about a GAI. And to get in on the action, of course, we have Ontario in the vast budget committing to launch a GAI pilot. And the other thing that hasn't really come up in this conference so much so far is a lot of people in the sort of the tech sector, in entrepreneurship, are talking about a GAI more as something that could buffer what is sort of seen as the increased precarity of work, which was touched on a little bit, but also the potential for a lot more unemployment that's going to be coming down the pipeline with a lot of automation and the advance of artificial intelligence. You've probably heard some of the statistics about how people have done research about how in the next 20 years, 42% of the sort of Canadian workforce could be automated out of a job. Obviously, there'll be some new jobs created, but what are we going to do when all these people don't have jobs anymore? You look at what's happening with taxi drivers right now, for instance. Some people are saying a GAI could be a potential solution to this sort of thing. So, what was our research question specifically? We wanted to know how the introduction of a GAI could potentially impact social entrepreneurs in Ontario. So we've got a definition of GAI up here and a definition of social entrepreneurship. One thing that I would note is that we talk about a GAI as a payment to everyone. Now, as we sort of talked a little bit about yesterday, that may mean that people who make a lot of money right now would get paid a GAI, but that may, given sort of the progressive nature of our tax system, they may end up never actually seeing a check. It may just be a line on their tax form, and it's sort of a deduction. But regardless, that's sort of the definition we're working with. We think both of these are fairly defendable definitions. That we can obviously talk about them. There's a lot of sort of contestation in this space, but as a means of moving forward with our research, this is what we're working with today. So, why is this an important question? So the real sort of big reason we think this is an important question is there's actually been very, very little work done on GAI and social entrepreneurship. There's not been very much done on entrepreneurship. We started to move a little bit towards that in a report we released recently with Dr. Forget. But on social entrepreneurship in particular, there's very little actual sort of empirical research on this, and we're trying to sort of start to fill that space a little bit. We also think it's quite interesting because a lot of social entrepreneurs are working towards objectives or outcomes that a lot of people sort of see as the objective or outcomes of a guaranteed annual income. And so we see a lot of overlap there, and the potential for a GAI, and we don't know yet, but if it's able to support more social entrepreneurship, it could have a multiplier effect in that, in addition to the benefits of a GAI for people generally, by promoting more social entrepreneurship, it could actually further those objectives even more. And so that's something that we're interested in. Also currently, coming more from the social entrepreneurship side of things, social entrepreneurs currently, they have a lot of trouble accessing funding. They don't really fit into traditional boxes. So a lot of the time for sort of work on the more charitable end, you need to be a registered charity in order to get funding. A lot of social entrepreneurs, while some are charitable, have charitable status, a lot of them don't. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have people who are working in for-profit enterprises, but who also have social objectives. But because they have these social objectives, they may not either have or be viewed by more traditional investors as being able to produce a strong return on investment. So they have difficulty accessing the more traditional mechanisms of funding on that side of the spectrum too. So they sort of fall through the cracks a little bit. So how did we go about looking at this question? Our research started with a partnership with the Centre for Social Innovation in Toronto, which is a hub for social entrepreneurship and people who are interested in working on solutions to social and environmental problems, and perhaps also making a profit at the same time, but not necessarily so. Our research had sort of three components. The first was a self-report survey, the second was a focus group, and the third was a series of individual case study interviews that we did. As you can see, we have this research has some limitations to it. I mean, the first is that when we did our survey, which was a survey of all the members of the Centre for Social Innovation in Toronto, we had a somewhat low response rate. It was an email survey. Only 23% of the 1,470 people we emailed actually responded. So there could be some bias in our findings. We don't really have a good idea of what, if any, what systemic bias there might be. But if anyone who's better at this sort of thing wants to suggest it, then we can look into it. So that's a potential concern. The other is that it's a self-report survey, and so people may not be reporting, they may be reporting what they think is the truth, but it may not actually be the facts. And then the other is that we were surveying people who are in Toronto, and mostly in downtown Toronto. And so obviously they're going to have a very different experience from social entrepreneurs here. But given the sort of resources that we had, this is sort of where we thought we might start. So I'm going to turn it over at this point to Christine, who's going to tell you a little bit about what we found when we sort of talked to these social entrepreneurs, both in the survey, the focus group, and in the interviews. And then she's going to talk a little bit about what some of our initial findings were.
Thanks, Michael. Hi, everyone. I'm going to need there it is, the pointer. So yeah, like Michael said, I'm going to kind of drill down into what we actually found. And like he said, this is still research in progress. So any insight or any questions that we didn't really provide an answer for, like we're really eager to kind of hear what's important from this group as well. So I'm going to present the research in two sections. So first, we really wanted to understand who are social entrepreneurs today? What drives them to be social entrepreneurs? What keeps them being social entrepreneurs? How much money are they making? What's their working conditions like? And we really thought it's really important to understand who are social entrepreneurs before we can understand how would a GAI potentially impact this group of people or change this group of people. And then the second, I guess, like group of findings is we developed kind of a framework of how we think a GAI would actually influence social entrepreneurship. And we identified kind of three high-level pathways through the data we collected from the surveys, the focus groups, and the case interviews. So I'll present the data in those two kind of buckets. So first here, we looked at some demographic characteristics. So what was important here is, when Michael and I were doing some of the focus groups and in some of our research before, there is this commonly held assumption by some that people who are social entrepreneurs today really are these heroic, altruistic individuals who are more courageous than the regular person in order to go in and take the risk and do this work. What we did find there is somewhat of a level of opportunity that's at play in becoming a social entrepreneur today. So we found in our sample, about 70% of our sample was of white European descent. Only about 30% were visible minorities, and about 2% were from the Aboriginal community. Those are under the population numbers in Toronto. I think it's 47% for visible minorities and 4% for Aboriginal communities. That might be a little bit off, but 80% had an undergraduate degree or higher, with 38%, I think, having a master's degree or higher, which is a fairly well-educated sample. We had a little more female than male, about 54% to 46%. Age groups, I think, was another interesting one. So majority of our sample were between 26 to 35 years of age. But we did have the other two kind of underrepresented groups that I thought was interesting was the over 65, only 4%. And there's, I think, about 14% of individuals in Toronto over 65. So that's generally an underrepresented group as well. And even youth, 9%. I think that's also a little bit under. What level of income are our social entrepreneurs earning? So again, we were a little surprised with the level of income that we were seeing because we thought it would actually be much lower. We see 25% here in the 30 to 50,000 range of individual earned income, 24% 50 to 75,000, and then we have these three areas are all above 75,000, so the 9, the 3, and the 7. So those are all above 75,000, about 19% of the population. And then about 21% reported below 30,000. And I think below 30,000 is the living wage in Toronto as well. We also asked about supplementary health plan coverage. 52% of the sample said they were covered by some sort of health plan. About 17% had only a family plan. They didn't have a plan on their own. And about 42% were not covered at all by any sort of supplementary health plan. We also did find in some of the qualitative research, about 44% said that if they had more financial resources, they would probably spend more time on their primary social mission work. So that was interesting as well. So what working conditions are social entrepreneurs working in? So we asked kind of what role they play. So we asked them whether they are leading an emerging organization, whether they're leading an established organization, whether they're an independent consultant, or whether they work for an organization. So the sample was pretty much distributed equally. We had 20% people who work as independent consultants or who see themselves as independent consultants, 20% who are staff at a social mission organization, and we did kind of 40% hold leadership positions, but that's broken up 20% about lead established organizations and about 20% lead emerging organizations. We looked at kind of their hours worked. We found an average of about 44 hours worked per week in our sample. We were curious about whether this group was working multiple jobs, a lot of hours in order to get by. About 80% were working a second job, but we found about the average was around 66% of their time was actually spent on their social mission work. The legal classification, this is important because in Ontario, there's no actual corporate status for social enterprise, which is talked about a lot in the sector as a problem because of the issues Michael talked about. There's a lot of time it's not really recognized, so the eligibility for funding tends to slip through the cracks. We found about 38% of our sample were incorporated as for-profit organizations, 23% as not-for-profit, 23% were unincorporated, and 9% were registered as charities. So we wanted to kind of understand how some of these variables were related to each other. So we ran a few kind of quick pivot tables off the side. We didn't really run any, detailed regression analysis yet. We ran a whole bunch. We picked out just a couple that we thought would be interesting. But if there are any kind of variables that you think would be interesting to see how they relate to each other, we'd be interested in hearing about it. But we'll show you kind of the few we picked out. So we wanted to see, is there a relationship between earned income and working hours for this group of people? Based on this, there really isn't much. Like across the income spectrum, people are relatively working around the same amount of hours. You see a little bit lower for people earning between $18,000 and $30,000, and a little bit lower for those in 0 to 9,000, which could be because they're students. We didn't really dig into why in that, but this is kind of at the high level. But everyone else is pretty much working the same hours at the different income levels. We wanted to know is the relationship between the type of social entrepreneur, whether they lead an established organization or an emerging organization, or whether they're an independent consultant in regards to how much money they make. This is a lot of data, so each of the bars is a different type of social entrepreneur, and the colors represent the different income levels. But I think if you just kind of step back, you could see that the established leaders actually have a higher proportion of people making over $50,000 and $75,000 a year, which isn't that surprising because they perceive themselves as established, so it's likely because they probably are earning more income from their organization. The third question that we wanted to know was, is there a relationship between corporate form and earned income? I think this is based on what Michael and I have both mentioned about their eligibility for funding and grants and these types of things. We did find, again, it's a lot of information here, but if you just look at the colors, you see for-profit organizations, there tends to be much more variability in how much income that they make relative to, say, registered charities, where you have a majority of people making kind of that middle 50 to 75,000. So people in for-profit who are registered as for-profit organizations, there's more kind of unpredictability in how much money you could potentially make, but we did find that there's more people making over 75,000, about 28% if you use a for-profit model. So there's more opportunity potentially to actually make more money in that case. Okay, so our framework for analysis. So based on kind of the data that we collected, we basically kind of found there are these three main pathways that we think a GAI could potentially influence social entrepreneurship. So we called them create, build, thrive. The first, create, is about how a GAI could help reduce barriers to entry for social entrepreneurs. So where there's that based on the fact that it's really unpredictable and unstable, there could be an opportunity for more people from different backgrounds, from different income groups to actually become social entrepreneurs if there was a GAI. The second pathway is build, so how a GAI could potentially improve the capacity of social entrepreneurs currently, so in regards to skills training, allowing them to hire more people, grow their organizations. And then the third is around thrive, and that's around the GAI's direct impact on the well-being and quality of life of social entrepreneurs. And we'll kind of walk through each of those paths. So for the reduced barriers to entry, again, having your basic needs met would allow a lot of people to take that risk to leave the traditional labor market and go in and work in social entrepreneurship if they so choose. The GAI would increase real or perceived value of social mission work, and that might encourage more people to go into it. So because today social mission work is generally not as highly valued as work that's more in the traditional labor market, by providing a GAI, you're kind of adding that value to that work. And the third, the opening up opportunities for individuals from underrepresented groups. So if you notice in kind of the demographic data, we see groups from visible minorities and from the over 65 community who are underrepresented. A lot of the times those are the groups that social entrepreneurs are actually serving. So to open up opportunities for those individuals to come and work as social entrepreneurs, you could be unlocking some really important social innovation within those communities. So people who are actually from those communities are serving those communities. And so we put a little quote here from one of our surveys. We asked, how would a GAI help or change your work? They said, a GAI would encourage me to start a new social purpose business so that I don't have to incur the full cost of entrepreneurship. So how we think a GAI would impact capacity of social entrepreneurs. It would provide kind of this early pre-seed funding for social entrepreneurs. So there was a report put out last year, Enterprising Change, by the Canadian Economic Development Group, I think. Paul Chamberlain, I think is his name. And they showed how kind of early stage social enterprises, so in 0 to 3 years, tend to get most of their funding from private individuals or foundations. Again, for social entrepreneurs who are for-profit or unincorporated, they may not be eligible for that kind of funding. So a GAI would provide kind of that early pre-seed funding to help these individuals kind of launch their ideas. Enabling social entrepreneurs to devote more time and resources to their social businesses. One of the big things that we heard is the current granting system is really putting a lot of barriers to a lot of these social entrepreneurs. So the quote in the bottom we chose, I think really highlights it well. So the entire granting system is completely broken from its base. I've gotten one grant for $4,000, and I basically had to promise them about $75,000 worth of work. So the administrative burden that's put on a lot of these individuals to actually get such a small amount of money, it takes a lot of time away from them actually working on their core social work. And then the evaluation component at the end of it also takes a lot away, and there's no extra money usually given for that kind of work as well. The other issue is the lag time. So you apply for a grant, you might not get it for a year. When you're starting when you're starting a small business, things come up. You might have to make decisions quickly. If you don't have that cash in pocket to just put out right off the bat, you might then miss out and not be able to actually launch your idea. And then the third, I think that was interesting, was around innovation. So one guy in the focus group mentioned how a lot of the grants, they want to see, innovative work that you're doing. They want to fund more innovative work, where a lot of the time these individuals just need to pay rent, pay their employees' wages, and they can't really find money that's going to allow them to do that at times. And then providing social entrepreneurs opportunities to increase their skills and capabilities. So this was an interesting one. Not a lot of people actually mentioned that if they had a GAI, they would then go in and do more training. When we did kind of push them a bit and ask them, they were like, oh yeah, okay, yeah, no, training would be good, because it is very complex sometimes to run a social business where you have to balance both for-profit and not-for-profit operational considerations. But many people did mention that if they did get a GAI, they would hire more people to compensate for maybe where they lacked in their skills, so they could kind of grow their business. And the GAI's impact on the well-being and quality of life of social entrepreneurs. We looked at how, right now social entrepreneurs they're not in the regular labor market, so they don't get unemployment insurance. So if they can't work for a certain period of time, there's nothing really there to protect them. There is unemployment insurance for entrepreneurs. However, the eligibility is you have to have shown you've earned $6,000 the year before. For a lot of people starting a small business, for a small social business, that might be kind of difficult and not actually provide them with the support that they need. Ensuring social entrepreneurs who need social assistance are able to access it. So we heard a lot about stigma, about the current welfare system from this group. One guy mentioned that, he once went in to collect his benefits, and he just left because of the shame that he felt. He didn't want to go through with it. It felt like a failure. One other guy mentioned that, the way the system is set up right now, I feel like welfare is just for people to take care of kids. Like I'm not taking care of kids, but if I had a GAI, it's for everyone, so I wouldn't feel bad receiving it, and I wouldn't feel bad using it on my social business. So that was really interesting, and it kind of indicated to us there's a kind of maybe a take-up issue for people who might be eligible who aren't receiving it. And then reducing social entrepreneur stress levels. About 10% of people discussed how a GAI would reduce the stress that they have paying rent and this kind of thing, which would open up opportunities for them to focus more on their business, to focus more on long-term planning, just instead of paying the bills kind of month to month. Two of the quotes I put here is, with a GAI, if things didn't work out, I know I could still be a healthy person, and I could approach my work with less stress and a longer-term vision. So a couple of risks that we highlighted from our research that a GAI could potentially put on the social entrepreneurship sector. The first is increased competition. So if the current landscape of investment and funding kind of stays the same, and in theory the GAI does create more social entrepreneurs, you're going to see more competition within the community. For some, there could be a good thing there. You might see more innovation. It might drive more efficiency of different, small businesses. But there's also kind of what that could do to the social entrepreneurship community. A lot of people talked about how the support and peer networks that they get from being in this community really helps them kind of keep going. And that could be eroded once you start to increase competition. The second risk is increased duplication. So you might just get a lot more people doing the same thing, and basically if a GAI is just going to provide more of that pre-seed funding, it's really going to be in those early stages that you might have duplication. So you might see kind of a bottleneck happening there. And if right now, Michael will talk about this more, but right now there isn't really a strong kind of common measurement framework across social businesses to measure their social impact. So there really isn't a good way to compare and contrast like who's having the most impact or not. So even though you might have more choice for investors and clients on who they choose to invest in or to serve their needs, you might actually get kind of this problem where the newer entrants to social entrepreneurship might be disadvantaged because they might not get that additional funding because people don't know them, they don't have the right networks, there might be kind of a favoritism that feeds into that bottleneck. And then the last is the reducing work effort. So this came up in our focus group. A lot of the social entrepreneurs were worried themselves, like what if after a GAI, other people just decide to stop working, or they don't do as much work in their social mission work. One woman also mentioned, what really motivates her is that she's making it on her own. She really likes the idea of like bootstrapping. And she even mentioned how when she was on maternity leave, she actually worked less, and she said that was a negative thing. So I think that's a positive thing, actually. I think the reduced pressure to work less isn't necessarily a bad thing. The negative is that it could potentially impact the social impact of the social entrepreneurship sector as a whole. So these were kind of some of the things that came up. And that's it for our results. Michael?
So yeah, as I mentioned, I'm just going to sort of sum things up a little bit with some concluding thoughts and some potential things to think about as we move forward. So I guess the first thing to start with is what the potential impact for social entrepreneurs themselves is. And we highlighted a number of different ways. Christine mentioned them, increasing the number and diversity of social entrepreneurs, building the capacity within the sector, and reducing stress and well-being. And we think all of these open up an opportunity for greater innovation and to make the sector more productive of the sorts of things that it's trying to build. Better impacts for, better social impacts and better impacts for the environment. For the ecosystem, sort of taking a more macro perspective, we think that in order to sort of address some of those potential risks that might come up from the introduction of a GAI, there would need to be some sort of adaptation of that ecosystem, what's going to mediate the impact of a GAI. And basically the idea here is if we put a bunch of new money through in the form of GI into this sector, the sector will need to adapt in order to make best use of that money. As we heard yesterday, if you throw a whole bunch of money at a problem, even if it's a poorly designed system, you're probably going to get some better results anyway. But if we wanted to maximize the potential positive outcomes for society, there'd be some other changes that would need to be made. Christine mentioned this idea of a common measurement framework and this potential bottleneck. It's important both for society, I think, but also for social entrepreneurs, because if you have a whole bunch of people rushing into the sector because now they've been freed up by having this GAI to do work they're really passionate about and really want to make a contribution, but if you have the same system now, you're going to have a whole bunch of people at the pre-launch stage. And unless you provide a better way of selecting those enterprises which have the best potential to make a big difference and gearing them up for the future, in some ways it's a lot of wasted effort, and it's potentially very bad for the people who have left their traditional careers, gone into this, and then sort of perhaps are squandering opportunity as they sit unnoticed in this sort of pre-launch stage. That goes hand in hand with the potential growing, you need to grow investment in this space. Right now it's a very small sector, already it struggles for funding. If you're going to have a whole bunch of more people trying to do this work, in order to take advantage of the passion and the ideas and the innovation that a GAI might unleash, you're going to need to increase supports. And so that could take a number of different forms, one of which would be to sort of address this network of umbrella organizations, intermediaries, hubs, accelerators, all these support services that exist for this sector currently. By bolstering them, you can also multiply the impact that a GAI could have, on the sector. Finally, we also wanted to make a few sort of observations specifically for the Ontario pilot. And basically what we're saying is that a GAI, at least from our preliminary research, could have a very significant and potentially transformative impact on the social entrepreneurship sector. And we think that we're not the people at the end of the day who have to sort of decide what are the priorities for a pilot in Ontario, but if this research and other research like it shows that this impact is potentially large and large enough to be considered as something that we really want to pay attention to, we need to think about how we design the pilot so that the sort of things that the pathways we talked about could actually be captured in sort of the data collection that a pilot would do. And so, for instance, one thing that obviously comes to mind is when you're a social entrepreneur and you're working on a product or a service or an idea, and you're not getting paid to do this, you're using your GAI to support you over that development phase of 1 or 2 years before you start to see a real return on things. Unless the sort of data collection is sensitive to that fact that maybe you're not getting paid for this, but you're still working, then that sort of effect could be lost. It's just someone they're not being paid, so it doesn't get counted in terms of work. But I mean, you could think of it as an investment that pays off 2 years down the line. So they are working, and unless you sort of design the pilot properly, you might not capture that, which would understate the impact of a GAI on this particular sector. The other thing that we just wanted to point out again, and this is preliminary research, we're not saying that this is the thing that we should be building the case for GAI on, but if a pilot were to be done, and it were to be done in a way that measured the impact of social entrepreneurship, this could potentially be a part of building a robust case for a GAI. If we could show that by liberating a lot of people from the need to trade work for sustenance, they were freed up to spend a lot more time focused on helping others, helping the environment, building businesses and organizations that are achieving these goals, then that could be part of a very robust justification for a GAI, especially if we had tools like a sort of a common measurement framework, which allowed us to sort of quantify and demonstrate very powerfully what this impact could be. That could be a real big part of the conversation, the political discourse, which could potentially tip the balance in favor of moving forward with something like this. So that's all that we have to say here today. Like I said, we're very keen to hear thoughts, and so our emails are up there. The slides I know are being shared. If anyone has any thoughts, anything that they think we missed, anything that we should emphasize more, please do not hesitate to be in touch. And well, like Charles said earlier, we're hoping to publish the paper that's going to come out of this research project before Christmas, and we would love to be able to include some perspectives from this room. Thank you.